Hello, everyone. Welcome to our eBird panel. I'm really excited to have these five panelists with us tonight. They're all experts on eBird in some manner, fashion enthusiasts, and know a lot about it and are going to share a lot of their knowledge with us tonight. So I'm really excited. With a pleasure to introduce them, Sierra Glassman on maybe if each of you could raise your hand maybe when I introduce you. Just graduated from UC Berkeley. She's a officer in the Bears for Birds, which is an Audubon on campus chapter at UC Berkeley and researches bird behavior. Brian Sullivan is the publications lead and information science at the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology and a former project leader for eBird. He's a founding member of eBird since 2005. Tom Edell is the San Luis Obispo County eBird reviewer since 2006. And he coordinates the records for the Journal of North American Birds since 1983 in San Luis Obispo County. Ronan Alam is also an officer for the Bears for Birds Audubon on campus chapter at UC Berkeley. He just graduated. Congrats, Ronan, and congrats, Sierra. Ronan's a physics major and also a major eBird enthusiast. And finally, Dr. Morgan Tingley is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at UCLA. And his research combines field samples and big data, like using eBird to understand how humans affect geographic distributions, mostly with birds. And so I'm really excited for everyone to have the ability to hear from a different perspective and a different background on eBird tonight. And the first question I'd like to ask to the panel, I'd just like to ask them how eBird fits into their life and how they use eBird. So maybe we can start with Sierra, if you don't mind starting and just letting us know how eBird fits into your life and how you use it.
Sure. I'd say I use eBird like at least like 3 or 4 times a week, because I go birding a lot, and it helps me with like connecting with friends, like sharing the checklist and checking in with where my friends have been. And it also helps as a officer of a bird club with trip organization. I can see what birds are in what areas, and that helps me plan trips for our club. And it also satisfies my curiosity with not only its checklist feature, but other features such as the status and trends page, where I can see like migratory patterns.
Great, thanks, Sierra. Let's move on and see what Morgan has to say.
Yeah, I'm an ornithologist, but I'm not just an ornithologist. I'm also a birder. And so I think I started using eBird in 2004, pretty much in the earliest days. But now obviously I have bird journals on my desk. Like I don't think I've cracked them in a decade or more. And obviously keep all my own sightings on eBird. But in my professional life, I'm a scientist and I'm a professor, and a lot of the questions I ask are about how sort of how humans influence sort of all the ways that bird distributions and bird occurrence are changing. And these are really big questions, and so often we need essentially big data. And the history of ornithology is like people like me would go out and we'd do bird surveys. But you can like only do so many bird surveys per day across so many areas, and so things like eBird have really revolutionized the ability to know where birds are when in space and time, which really sort of expands a lot the questions that we can answer. One of the things I've also been organizing for the last few years, or the last year, and this is the second year of it, and I can talk a little bit about it later maybe, is a project that's based in California looking at the effects of wildfire smoke on birds. And for this, we are using eBird as the platform for the data, basically data curation. And we're actually just trying to work with community groups like local Audubon societies to actually collect eBird data in a slightly more systematic way so that we can actually study what happens when smoke comes in. Because smoke is one of these things that's like from wildfires, but it's very unpredictable. And so you just need it's really, really hard for scientists to study, which is why it's a big question and most people haven't studied it before. So anyway, I'll keep it brief for now, but I use eBird a lot.
Thanks, Morgan. For those of you who are Morrow Coast Audubon Society supporters and members and on our trips, we are partnering with Morgan's lab with a postdoc named Dr. Olivia Sanderfoot and on a project called Project Phoenix. And so if you're interested in submitting data to Morgan's research, then we'll be sending out an email in the next month or so with more information on how to do that. Really cool project, really, really cool science. Great, thanks, Morgan. Let's go on to Tom. Tell us a little bit about how eBird is used in your life, which I'm sure is quite a substantial time. Oh, you're on mute, Tom.
Yeah, I probably spend more time on eBird than I should, certainly more than my wife thinks I should, I'm sure. I've been a reviewer now since 2006, as we said earlier. I really came into eBird, well, I should say maybe backing up into birding. I've been more of a status and distribution kind of a person, looking at trends and trying to figure out where things are in the county for many years. And eBird fed right into that really nicely, and it allowed me to not only put in my records, but then look at what other people are doing and see where other people are finding birds. And I think knowing the status and distribution throughout the county has really helped me, ask for good details when something's out of range, know when something's out of range. And anyway, along with that, my work with the Birds of North American Birds Journal has, this has really helped me out when it comes to finding records that I need to submit to them, and also in getting documentation, because it was really hard to get documentation for a while. But now with eBird, it's a great vehicle for getting people to provide information and documentation for the records. Photos has been wonderful too. And so I review the photos every night for the county just to see what's coming through and see what's correctly identified, or maybe I should say incorrectly. And it's been really helpful. And then Merlin, of course, also has made it a lot more useful, but also up the workload in some ways. So, but it's all ties in really nicely. And I think it's been a great help to me in what I do.
Well, I speak for all of San Luis Obispo County birders when we say we're all so grateful for the work you do on eBird, Tom.
Thanks.
Ronan, tell us a little bit about how eBird fits into your life.
Yeah, so I use eBird mostly as a tool for birding, a nice handy place or a platform where I can track what species I've seen, where I've seen them, who I was with when I saw these birds. Similar to Sierra, right? Talking about how it helps with club trips and going birding with club members on campus. It's a really convenient platform to have all that data sort of collected in one place. Almost like a little journal, but digitized.
Thanks, Ronan. And Brian, head us off. Tell us about how eBird fits into your life, which is substantial, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it permeates just about all aspects of my life. Between eBird and Merlin and Birds of the World, I feel like I'm using one of those three things almost always. From a data entry perspective and from being a birder perspective, I think I'm a little unusual, and that I get really jazzed up to try to feel like I'm making a contribution, maybe because I'm close to sort of the data side of eBird. And I like to feel like I'm filling gaps on the map, sort of spatially and temporally. So I like to look for those gaps and go out and put in data from places where there's not a lot of birders, there's not a lot of coverage. I still like to get out on the coast in the spring and fall and look at tons of birds, but often I'm driving sort of in the opposite direction of where most birders are headed. From a data usage perspective, in my personal out of Cornell side, I'm working now on a North American field guide project for the last, since 2007. So it's coming along, but it's amazing to see the volume of data come into eBird that allows me to do what Tom was just talking about, like and look at patterns of distribution, migration timing, all this stuff that used to be hard is now really easy. You can just see it visually on the science pages. And one of the things I find myself doing most often is really poring over photos, sounds, and videos of birds from an identification perspective, because eBird and the Macaulay Library allow you to really look at, a refined set of images for a date range and a place, and you can compare apples to apples really easily, almost like a digital specimen tray, when you're looking at what do song sparrows look like here versus there in June. So I'm constantly in there looking at photos of birds and trying to get a sense of what's going on from that perspective. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff at our fingertips now. I think in this ecosystem, it's super exciting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. Before we go any further, I'm going to let all of the participants know that if you have a question you want answered or you want to see one of our experts answer, please send it to it's Bob Revel, who runs all of our technology, who's a wonderful guy. Send it. His name is Questions with 5 question marks today. And send it in a chat. The way you can do that is if you go down to the bottom of your screen and you click chat, and you can send a direct message to Bob at Questions, and that'll make it to me. And we'll try and get your question answered today. So keep that in mind. I'm going to ask all of you a pretty broad question, and some of you will have different answers because we all have different experiences. And my question is, how has eBird shaped birding culture over the last 20 years?
Maybe I can take a stab at that one.
Yeah.
When I first started at eBird, it was 2005. So I moved from California to Ithaca, New York, and the culture of birding at the time was, the internet was really just taking off. eBird was launched in 2002, and I remember trying it and being unimpressed, frankly, and how long it took me to get a set of notes from my notebook into that checklist, uploaded through a dial-up connection. I mean, it's hard for us to even, I'm sure Sierra and Ronan are like, dial-up, what is that? This was, in the old days, it took a long time to push even just a little bit of data across the internet. So birding was just taking shape. There were listservs and things like that still persist today. There was desktop listing software that was pretty popular. So birders who were really keen at that time were largely using things like Avasys and systems like that to keep track basically of their lists in various places around the world. But that was like, kept on your hard drive of your computer, an Excel file type stuff. I would say that the birding community, we had our work cut out for us, not only with the technology hurdle, but also birders were not really keeping complete checklists of birds as a default. So the first thing we really had to do was just travel all around North America and try to meet with as many birding groups as possible to explain why you should do a complete checklist of birds. And then the second thing was why you should estimate numbers, and those two things are hard for birders. I think a lot of birders at that time were really, focused on highlights of their birding day, and they would start at the top of a mountain and drive all the way down to the coast and maybe write down noteworthy birds on the way. But this idea of linking a list of birds with a discrete habitat with some metrics about your effort, that was really new for birders. So I think that thing, so when we started at eBird, maybe 80% of the data coming in were just incidental observations. But now it's the opposite. So 80% of the data are linked, maybe even more now, to effort-based checklists, which is what we can really use at a high level for the science that we do. So I think that in the last 20 years, we have seen a shift in awareness from either not recording birds in the field to using mobile apps that track your walk and, really allow us to explicitly tie the birds you're seeing to a location. I think that, eBird's been able to leverage those technology advancements pretty well and deliver some enjoyment, excitement, and delight to birders along the way. So I think that's the big thing from my perspective.
Thanks, Brian. Tom has his hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on what Brian said. I think what he just described is a great way to look at how things have progressed. But, if you want to go back further with the long perspective, which I think I can offer maybe over everybody else, I started out at Audubon meetings where the only way you found out about a bird was going to the meeting and they would tell you what was seen lately. And then that led into a phone tree, which, if you can believe, that wasn't especially good way to do it, but it worked. And then we went from there to listservs, and then it went to eBird, and then finally now it's basically a lot of stuff is just out on apps, so WhatsApp, things like that. So it's really been an interesting progression over the last 40 or 50 years. And I mean, prior to the Audubon meetings, I don't know how anybody found out except by talking to the few people that you knew who might be birders. So with that in mind, I think some of the later things that eBird's done now has really helped share trips, such as the trip reports, which are really valuable. And as Ronan said, you can kind of use it to share with your friends. You can make a trip report. You can put in as much information as you want about where you went, who you were with, what the weather was like. All those things are good information. And it's also, of course, good just to have that on the individual checklist. So I think that, so as Brian also said, initially, a lot of us just were out there collecting lists of birds we saw. And it wasn't necessarily, it was like if I went to the Carrizo Plains, for example, I would do one list for the entire day and it would be highlights. And now, unfortunately, in some ways, I do 10 or 12 lists, checklists, each for different locations so that I can pinpoint where things were found and what other birds were in that specific habitat. So it's really been great for data collection and for teasing out, I think, the small changes in little habitats around the county and everywhere.
Thanks, Tom. Let's hear from Morgan.
Oh, sorry, I think I froze there for a second, but yeah, Brian's comments made me think, and so I went back into my eBird account just now, and even though I started putting species in around 2004, I didn't start doing complete checklist until 2011. So that my first 7 years of eBird usage is kind of wasted as scientific data. And then finally, it came to me, okay, complete checklists, I need to put in abundance. But it's thinking back to, I came of age of birding during the listserv era in the late 90s. And we'd post lists, but you'd always start the list with like what the highlight was or what was the rare species. And maybe some people would only just post the thing that they found interesting. And, now we systematically keep track of abundances and all species, not just the ones we find interesting. And it's changed the way that it's birding. And obviously in the eBird context, that we can do that on our phones as we move around just makes it much more easy. I think 2011, I started doing complete checklists then, because I'm pretty sure that's around the time that the mobile app might have come out. Because before that, you're just keeping lists in your head or paper lists and then coming home and inserting them on the computer, which isn't much fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Morgan. I'm curious if I mean, as a user of eBird myself, I have seen some change even since I started using eBird in the mid 2010s and like 2014. I'm curious if you, Ronan, or you, Sierra, as part of a younger generation, have seen a shift, not just in birding culture, but eBird culture over that time as well, and how people actually use eBird.
I'd say, like, personally, I was kind of resistant to using it until like only like 4 or 5 years ago. So I think just looking at the younger generation, more people are adopting eBird over field journals. Though I do still think field journals are a valuable thing to keep. Um, but yeah, I guess that's my input.
Thanks, Sarah. Um, my next question for you all comes from somebody who submitted it before this seminar. And they were wondering if eBird and Merlin make birding more accessible for people coming into birding, and how does it in particular reinforce social aspects of birding?
I'm happy to give some preliminary thoughts. I'm interested to hear from others on this one, though. I would say that eBird is, I think, very difficult to approach for a beginning birder. It's a challenging app to use. We're throwing concepts at you like a complete checklist of birds. You don't know what any of these birds are, how to identify them. It's like jumping straight into the fire. And then if you report something that's, incorrect or wild, Tom's going to send you a note and you're going to be like, whoa, this is serious stuff, and I could think it could be quite off-putting for a beginning birder who's just like, I don't know how to identify birds. I want to enjoy birds. I don't necessarily want to record birds even yet. I just want to look at them, understand them a little bit, learn about them a little bit. I think eBird is not built for that, right? But I do think that Merlin is built for that, right? Merlin was built and launched under the premise of answering one simple question, which is, what bird am I looking at? And initially it was just a series of questions that used smarts like, eBird frequency data in the background and this sort of algorithm to help you know that the blue and orange bird sitting on the fence in Monterey, California is most likely a Western bluebird, But then we launched Photo ID with Merlin, and now Sound ID has been this thing that's opened up birding to an audience that has been curious about birds. Almost everyone is curious about, like, what birds are in my yard, or what's that beautiful song that I hear every morning. Now they've got this app that they can fire up that helps them understand what birds are singing, what birds are around them, lets them look at different types of media and a little snippet on identification. And I think the direction of Merlin, if I could be so bold as to speak for the team that runs Merlin, is to really now try to figure out, I believe the latest stat is something like Merlin's on 17 million devices, that's a lot of people. That's a big chunk of people. And the challenge, I think, the exciting challenge for the Merlin team is, how do we take those people and really bring them on a journey through birding that doesn't necessarily end at eBird. It might end at eBird for some people who are interested in keeping a list and getting more interested in that side of things and the science side, but it might end in another direction for somebody who just is interested in different enjoyment of birds, and how do we understand what those pathways are for the different types of people in that group of 17 million, and really engage and broaden that out even more. I think 17 million is probably a drop in the bucket for the number of people that are interested in birds, even just in North America alone. So I think we've made good progress, but we've got a long way to go to really saturate that market, even just in North America.
Thanks, Brian. Ronan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I basically wanted to, agree with everything you said about how eBird and Merlin are designed, and how my personal experience with these two apps has been pretty much spot on with what you described. Um, Trying to make my first eBird checklist was, pretty confusing. It was a pretty big, uh, 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 I guess, learning curve in like having to, um, note down the abundance and like what species I even saw. And I feel like that's where Merlin, fits that niche exactly, where you just start recording a song and it'll tell you, here's the most likely species and here's what you're listening to. And I feel like also, um, kind of going back to that part in your question where you can share this knowledge with new birders. I think that's where Merlin excels, because you can really from a birder who is more experienced to someone who is less experienced, Merlin can really help. Um, you can show someone that spectrogram that is doing a live recording, and then see that species pop up on the phone itself. And I think that's something that can give someone a very clear like aha moment of, oh, that's what that song is, or that's what that bird song is. I can recognize it in this way. As opposed to an eBird checklist, you can show someone an eBird checklist, and I feel like you won't get that visceral, um, moment of learning.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's important to note that there are functions within the eBird desktop app, for example, that you can go in and have those moments, but it's a bit farther down the road, and Merlin is such a good gateway to that. Yeah, let's go back to you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, the eBird mobile app is really designed to help you record checklists of birds in the field. And it helps you understand, what birds are around you at locations, right? Finding birds, recording birds. That's what eBird mobile is for. But like you said, there's this whole desktop, and Sierra mentioned this early, the status and trends, these visualizations that the science team has generated now with eBird data, where you can go look at a Swainson's thrush migrate across its full, geographic footprint in this spectacular fashion, sort of is just, those are the really mind-bending outputs that are kind of, you have to know that they even exist on the web and go find them. Whereas Merlin puts that magic right in your app, and the sort of magic of bird ID. I'll just say that, I was just this past weekend at my daughter's softball game, and there's a guy that I, seen for a couple of years, and he's a doctor, and got talking about birds, and I told him about Merlin, and he went home, and the next week he comes back and he says, he literally said this: I downloaded Merlin. I love this. I want to know how to be a birder now. He's like, this is something that I want to pursue. Will you take me out and show me more about birding? And that's something we need to create, like recreate like millions of times. And Merlin does have this magic in it that will allow us to sort of scale that group of people that really could get interested in birds in a way that I don't think any other tool has so far.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Oh, we got Tom coming in at the buzzer. You're on mute, Tom.
I just wanted to chime in on what Brian said. Merlin is almost a gateway drug. It gets people going. Once they kind of learn that thing that it works, they're just amazed and they want to find out more. I have certainly seen people walking around parks in our area who have Merlin open who are not birders at all. They're just walking around because they enjoy knowing what birds are around. They probably will never be birders, but they find that app to be just fascinating. And so that's why I say it's a gateway drug.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to, in the same vein of as we're talking about eBird and some of the difficulties as a beginning birder, I was teaching a class about eBird earlier this month, And well, I wasn't teaching it. I was organizing it, and some really good eBirders that I know were teaching it. And I had a question from somebody, and this same question got echoed in some of the questions that were submitted before this panel. And it's coming from somebody who doesn't feel that they can contribute to eBird because they're not very confident in their skills as a birder. They say they see a small fraction of the birds seen by someone else who might be a more skilled observer of birds, and they also are unable to identify many of the birds they do see. And they feel that they would only distort the database in eBird by using eBird to just put in the species that they can ID. And so I wanted to ask you all, and this might be best geared towards Tom and Brian, but everyone can chime in on this as well, is if that's the case, if you're unable to identify birds, should you be creating an eBird checklist, and should you be putting in a checklist of only the birds you can successfully identify? How should you go about that? And should birders like this use eBird even though they might be limited in identification?
I have a very polished answer to that, but I'd like to bring up the rear on this one and hear what maybe Morgan and Tom think about this question.
Yeah.
I'll say that I know that at one point anyway, eBird or Cornell was trying to get people to use Merlin as a sort of their entry into birding because they could keep track of their life list. They didn't have the pressure of creating a full checklist with all the numbers. And I think it was a good idea to give people a chance to get their feet wet, so to speak. And then once they felt comfortable with identifying birds and maybe paying attention to the numbers, they could move into eBird. I think that's still what they have in mind, but I'm not positive. Maybe Brian knows if that's still what they're looking for. But obviously, full checklists are the best and the most valuable. But I guess to some degree, from what I understand from the research side, even lesser checklists are valuable. So I'll let maybe Morgan or Brian talk about that.
Sure. Let's hear from Morgan.
Yeah. I mean, as a scientist, we use a lot. Like, we basically used as much of the data as can fit the purpose. And so scientists use eBird data for all sorts of different purposes because eBird can tell us about so many different things. At the most basic level, we can think of eBird as telling us about the distribution of birds, where they are in space and time. And so even if you submit what we might consider to be a not very informative checklist, so an incidental checklist with no effort data that has no abundances, you just have an X to say that the species was present, and it's only one species, it's not a complete checklist. That data, that's still a data point that says, okay, at this place, at this time, this species was there, which is like, honestly, kind of as good as you get out of, like, honestly, these massive museum collections we have around the world. Obviously, those have they have actual physical specimens in them too, so the specimens tell us more. But eBird is, constantly telling us just millions and millions of data points. We just published a study looking at urban biodiversity in the Los Angeles area, where we're using just vast quantities of data at very fine spatial scales. And so we're using people who just happen to have checklists of the birds, in their backyards or their county parks or in the parking lot of the grocery store. And, scientists, we use that data. And so, we also know that things are incomplete. Like, any distributional scientist like myself, we know that any list of birds, and this is true of a bird watcher, this is true of an ornithologist who's like professionally trained in counting birds, you're always going to miss individuals and you're going to miss species. And so the worry that you as a bird watcher are not going to be able to identify everything correctly, we know that. Like, everything we do tries to account for that. Like, we go through all of these hoops, we teach ourselves lots of crazy statistics in order to try and correct for that, because everyone has that problem. It's not just you. And so, so that's what we do. The one thing I will say, the problem that we haven't fixed quite yet is misidentifications. And so when I'm giving advice, what I say is that if you're unsure about the species that you've seen, it's better to register your lack of confidence than it is to be overconfident. So if you know that it's like a sparrow, but you don't know what kind, eBird will allow you to say sparrow spot, right? Sparrow species. Like you don't know what kind of sparrow, but it is a sparrow. And that's great. That's put into the level of your confidence, because someone saying, oh, lark sparrow could occur in my backyard. I've never seen one, but one could occur. If I misid'd a song sparrow as a lark sparrow, some scientist, maybe myself, might make a misunderstanding about where lark sparrows occur based off of that. And so people like Tom, their job is to like identify the obvious errors, but the more subtle errors, it's hard for us to do. And so that's the one warning I say is that if you're not sure, it's better to be confident about your lack of confidence than it is to be overconfident.
Thanks, Morgan. And Brian, let's hear your polished answer.
Yeah, I think to the broader question, should you participate in eBird, the answer is definitely yes. We've built this thing with very specific back-end functionality that allows us to help you report what you're seeing to the best of your ability. And it's really key, that last bit, to the best of your ability, because when you sign into eBird, it's just like signing into a bank account or everything that you do is tied to your observer ID in our system. And your pathway through eBird over time differs from mine, Tom's, everybody's is slightly different. And we actually track that pathway and factor that into the status and trend models and understand how birders improve over time with their ability to detect different species. More species more quickly is a metric we called species accumulation curves. And species accumulation curves tend to be steeper in experienced birders than they are in non-experienced birders. And then I would say, and we factor all that into the model when we're using data from every individual, the million or so now that are submitting complete checklists of birds that we use in the science data set. I would say that there's a very important question when you're doing a checklist of birds, which is, are you reporting all the species that you saw or heard to the best of your ability? And that when you answer yes to that, all that tells us is, I'm not leaving starlings off because I don't like them. I'm not, leaving this bird or that bird off. I'm reporting all the birds I saw, all the species I saw that I could detect. And that really allows us to do so much with the data, even if you are a beginning birder. Because as Morgan just pointed out, no one detects every individual in every species on any given outing, right? And we can handle that if you are specific in saying, yes, I'm reporting a complete checklist to the best of my ability, because chances are 3-4 years down the line, your ability changes. Sometimes for the better, and for someone like me who's maybe getting a little bit older, can't hear as much, maybe sometimes for the worse for some set of birds. So yeah, I think all that stuff gets factored in. And then the point about the taxonomy is a really important one. The taxonomy that underlies eBird is built for birders in the field, meaning that you can put bird species into that taxonomy if you want, or shorebird species, or even a slash like greater slash lesser yellowlegs or the dowitchers. It's built to allow you to report to your highest level of confidence. So it's really flexible that way. And then finally, I'll just say that the work that Tom and the network of some 3,000 now regional editors around the world does to maintain this set of back-end filters that sit behind the scenes, those things control what you see on your checklist when you open up eBird and what's most likely in a given at a given date and location. That's really, really important for weeding out, the wild stuff. And then as the harder ones are when two species are similar and both are common and you're not identifying them correctly. That's why we have the slash combinations for things like purple / house finch, those kinds of things. As birders get better and better, they can start to report them at the species level, but we have those higher level groupings if you're just not sure. So anyway, that's a fairly long-winded way of saying, try it. I would say start in your yard, the place where you're most familiar. Use it in your yard for a little while, then branch out to your local park, take it on a birding trip to the beach or wherever. Start with where you're familiar and kind of get used to it before, I wouldn't take a trip to Africa and fire it up there for the first time. I think that'd be tough.
Thanks, Brian. We have a question from the audience that ties into this a little bit. And someone's curious about how data using breeding codes or subspecies, is that something that's really important to include on your eBird checklist from a science standpoint and when it's being used for scientific? And Morgan, your hand's up already. I was going to direct this questions to you, so take us away.
Yeah, those are great questions. And so we can think of like the data that eBird has had for a long time and the way that eBird has expanded to allow additional types of data. And so some of these things people are starting to use, but not fully using all the time yet. So before I was in Connecticut about 5 years, or before I was in California, I was in Connecticut for about 5 years, and I helped run a state bird atlas in Connecticut. And Connecticut, like a lot of actual bird atlases around the country, use eBird now as the back platform for collating and storing all the data. And eBird actually has a service where they make portals specifically for state atlases. And in an atlas, what you're collecting is you're collecting breeding codes. And so while eBird now collects all this data, and actually it's incredibly useful for atlases, at any point you can actually put that data in. We, like my lab, the team of scientists that I work with, we've actually been experimenting with using eBird breeding codes to study breeding phenology. So you can put in things like if you find eggs, or if you find a nest, or if you find fledglings, or if you see a copulation. A scientist like me, one of the things I study is phenology. So that's the seasonal events. So annual seasonal events. So like when birds migrate, or when birds build nests, or when the eggs hatch. And these seasons are changing with climate change. And it's one of the questions that we're really interested in. But it's also hard to study. The US doesn't have a real phenology monitoring program for birds across the entire country. But there's enough eBird checklists out there now where people are putting in breeding codes that we can actually start to build up essentially a national level breeding phenology monitoring program just using people's breeding codes in eBird. Where it's like early stage work, at least on the work that I've been involved in, but it's one of those things where, if you have 1 million checklists, but 1,000 of them have breeding codes, that can be really, really useful. And so the more people actually who think to put that stuff in, the more useful it can be to science, because often we have the ideas, but it's a question of data limitation. So the more people do it, the better it is for us.
Thanks, Morgan. Sounds like a strong endorsement of using breeding codes. And if you all don't know what those are, that is on your eBird checklist. When you actually submit your checklist, you can click on the bird on your phone, and there's a bunch of purple codes that'll pop up underneath the bird, and some of them might be nest with young, some might be a copulation event. some other stuff like that. So
It's
we'll get
definitely next level eBirding though. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
don't
it's a-
start that on day one.
milestone that you'll unlock. Yeah, we'll go to Tom.
Yeah, this brings up something that I wanted to talk about anyway, and that's that eBird has an extensive help page. And on that help page, you can find out how to use breeding codes and what they mean. And so the app won't necessarily tell you that right off, but I think it's good to go in and look through the help pages when you're getting into eBird and when you have questions about how to use the program. And because they're very extensive and they're really helpful. And as far as using the codes, yeah, it's good to only use them when you have a solid idea what they mean. I know I just saw a checklist the other day that had a breeding code for wandering tattler in this area, which obviously is not a bird that would breed here. So really the breeding code shouldn't be used for it. So that's just one example of why you need to really understand what you're doing when you use them so that you're not feeding bad data to people like Morgan. Or inaccurate, maybe is a better way to put it.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. And then Brian, we'll finish with you.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was a bit about subspecies in there as well, I think, in that question. And subspecies reporting in eBird is definitely a more advanced feature. If you're a beginning eBirder, I would recommend strongly just turning off subspecies altogether when in your checklist so you can just hide them, right? So you don't have to worry about subspecies, focus on species first. If you're an advanced birder and you're trying to understand subspecies guidelines in eBird, you can read about them, as Tom said, on the website. Subspecies reporting can be very useful when subspecies are readily field identifiable and multiple subspecies occur together in the same area. So things like, Audubons and myrtle warblers, those are readily separated. And if you're an advanced birder, you can report those. And eventually, if there's a taxonomic split of those two species, we already have data in the system at the subspecies level that'll help us with that split work. I would strongly advocate not using subspecies if you don't know what you're doing, because it causes problems. So yeah, subspecies is a bit of a can of worms. It's probably a little deep to dive into here.
Thanks, Brian. I want to shift lanes a little bit now, and I want to talk a bit about the social aspects of eBird as a tool. And we have a question that I'm going to attempt to blend with another question here. We'll see how well I do. The question that comes in from the audience is, do we still think that there's a place for listservs in the future, and how eBird might incorporate listservs into its in building it into the eBird community? And I want to combine that question about listservs with a question that I got beforehand about two different directions that eBird is growing in. And one is a scientific direction where it's being used for scientific data and scientific research, specifically with respect to land use change and climate change. And the other direction that eBird is growing is more of a social birding aspect, right? Where birders can use eBird to see what other birders are doing, where other birders are birding, where different birds are being seen, how they might tailor their travels. And so I guess the bigger picture question is, how, in your opinion, and this is for everyone to answer, and I encourage everyone to answer this, can eBird continue to grow in both those directions? So in the science direction, and also something like incorporating listservs in a more birding social aspect. And how do we grow in both those directions with respect to each other?
Well, I'll say one thing about listservs if I can.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's that obviously they were very valuable for a long time, and I think they've sort of been usurped by eBird to a large degree. And but they're still useful for when you want to talk about things that maybe your eBird doesn't show, whether it's relay some information about where a particular bird was seen. You can do it better maybe on writing it out on a listserv than you can by putting it in eBird. But I think to some degree it has had a dampening effect on listservs. And I think not only that, but certainly some of the apps that we all use now also have had a dampening effect on even eBird, maybe, in the fact that people are now getting most of their information from apps, or at least a lot of us are, who follow birds and want to know what's happening up to date. I'll leave the other answers to somebody else.
Thanks, Tom. See if anyone's wanting to tackle that big picture question.
Yeah, why not? I'll jump in. I think that it's interesting to see, because I think you've got listservs, you've got eBird, and then you've got these, for lack of a better term, social media apps like WhatsApp and these other things that I think that WhatsApp and that form of communication has now supplanted listservs almost completely. But the role that eBird plays is as a database of record, right? And that's different than what was there before with a listserv, because listservs were long narratives of someone's birding outing. It was very difficult to extract data. As Tom knows, in those days, he was reading every one of those, probably noting down anything of interest for North American birds and trying to extract data for North American birds on noteworthy sightings from those narratives. eBird now is capturing not only the noteworthy birds in the form of data, but data on common birds, which I would argue is different, but no less important for understanding the role that birds play in our ecosystem. You can't go into the back issues of North American Birds, for example, and see data on violet-green swallows unless there was some massive count that was noteworthy, right? eBird has data every day on violet-green swallows, many breeding codes, these kinds of things. It's giving us this baseline that was very hard to get at before for birds, all birds. And then I would say where eBird has fallen short and those apps have really, taken the ball and run with is how to get information about birds being seen now into the hands of people who are interested in having that information. eBird has rare bird alerts and things like that, but you don't want to find out about an ivory gull an hour later when the eBird email comes in, right? So my sense is that those apps are really the modern, phone tree, so to speak, of sharing information about bird sightings in real time, but they're not a database, and they're not capturing data in a way that's useful for science. And I think that maybe I'm naive, but I think most people understand that, and they still put their data into eBird and use the WhatsApp landscape, to communicate about birds. So, what that means for the longer term vision of eBird, I think that it needs to stay focused on the science role that it plays and the database role that it plays. I think Merlin can experiment a little more in that social space of helping birders connect with each other, talk about what they see, their journeys through birding, and bird identification. But eBird really has to stay focused on the role that it plays in the science space, is my sense.
Thanks, Brian. I'm curious if, as fellow young birders, Ronan and Sarah, if you have a sense, because I also have a sense of, I think when I was getting into using eBird, I was wishing that there were other ways to connect with birders through eBird, something like being able to follow someone's profile or something like that. I'm curious if you would see that as being a useful function moving forward of eBird, something in the future.
Yeah, I think some sort of follow method would be interesting, like receiving an email if your friend posted a checklist. Um, I personally have never used listservs, so my main social connections through eBird are birding in person with people and like checking manually on their profiles. But yeah, additional features that like boost how social the app can be without like I don't know, compromising the quality of the data in some way would be pretty cool.
Thanks, yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in on this as well because I think this sort of profile and following and connectivity concept that you're bringing up, I think it's something that I can compare with a very similar platform, iNaturalist, and how they're handling to a very similar, degree, like how you can make your own profile and then um, basically follow your friends on it and see what they're posting and the sort of species that they're uploading. So I think that, like you Sarah said, if it's not going to compromise the scientific direction of eBird, which I don't really see how directly it would, then yeah, that's something that would help with the social growth. I guess, simple. This might be a naive view or a simplistic view on things, but also one way in which growing the social aspect would help and contribute to the scientific aspect, I think, would be scale. Having a greater user rate, a larger user base would just give you more, like just a larger raw number of observations. And if that's, this is something I have no expertise in, but if that's an interesting concept, I think that one would feed into the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might add to that, increasing the social presence could create a more accessible culture of birding to groups of people who don't traditionally have access to birding as growing up as birders. Brian, I saw your hand raised there.
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation. I'm really glad to hear those comments from the younger generation because we spent about a year trying to, when I say we, a team of folks at the lab from eBird and Merlin spent about a year trying to architect the future of eBird and Merlin together in this app space and we tried hard to understand where the strengths of each of those apps was, what the optimal situation would be for those apps sort of crosswalking between communities, and imagining like if people had both of those apps on their phone, what would it look like if those things were really both tuned to work together at a very high level? Because today they're linked together, but just barely, and we outlined a set of work to really develop both of the apps in the future to work more closely together, where eBird can stay in the space of sort of serious building checklists, complete checklists of birds or incomplete checklists of birds, but that information would feed into more social features that would be developed in Merlin. You could think about firing up Merlin in the future and it having a birding feed where you can see your friends that you're following and their latest observations, noteworthy stuff, their complete lists right in Merlin. So there's no reason that we can't push data back and forth across those things without losing the focus of either of those two things, you know, and I think that's the very challenging and exciting suite of work that the lab has now to take on for the next, I'd say, 3 to 5 years.
Thanks, Brian. Morgan, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I don't have all that much more to add. I love hearing the inside scoop from eBird about priorities and futures and things like that. I've definitely been involved in conversations over the years with eBird people where we have a beer in hand and I start waxing about how eBird needs to add in more social media type functionality to build connectivity. And you know, like the contrast that Ronan brought up with iNaturalist is important, I think, in some ways, because you know, iNaturalist has grown a lot too, and obviously has birds, but it has everything else in it as well. But the strategies of Cornell with eBird and the people who are behind iNaturalist are quite different. In that iNaturalist really sees its primary audience and the utility of iNaturalist is to the user community, to sort of essentially kind of in a social way. Whereas eBird has, you know, coming from an academic institution, my impression has been from the beginning, it's been science focused and it's always been integrating the science with it. And of course, scientists use iNaturalist, but I can say as one of the scientists who uses iNaturalist, using iNaturalist data is really difficult. And partly because iNaturalist is not, no, and quote me on this, not nearly as friendly to scientists as eBird is. And so there is that difference there, and it goes to the core of even how the data are stored and how it's programmed and permissions and access and all that stuff. All right, now
Thanks.
I get myself in trouble.
No, I would just follow up.
Direct quote.
No, I would just follow up quickly and say that when eBird was launched in 2002, it was basically built by scientists for scientists with no I wouldn't say no thought, but with not enough thought given to why someone would actually want to use it, you know, every single day. And when we came in 2005, a team of folks really looked at that and said, well, there's some really no-brainer kinds of things that birders want that this thing doesn't deliver. So we started to build those basic tool sets that made it really sticky for birders, you know, but the science backbone has always been there in eBird, the idea of a complete checklist and being able to, you know, disentangle presence and absence, you know, with the data has been core to its science use and its uptake in the science community. We have a very good and very dynamic relationship with the folks from iNaturalist. And, you know, as you said, iNaturalist was built, you know, to try to bring people together around observing nature, all nature, not just birds, every organism on the planet. And talk about a hard task. You know, we struggle with the taxonomy just of birds. They're doing everything, you know, and they do amazing stuff. And the thing that sets birds apart, I'd say, makes them different than any other set of organisms on the planet is that there is this group of people that wants to go out and observe them every day. And we can do things like complete checklists of birds. And that's it's a meaningful sampling unit for birds that's very, very hard to do for any other kind of organism. Butterflies, maybe. Dragonflies, maybe. But try to go do a plant checklist that's complete. You know, it's just not the same thing. Or even mammals, or, you know, bats, or, you know, it's so hard to take what we can do with birds and apply it to other taxa in the way that eBird works, that I think the approach that iNaturalist has taken for dealing with the full set of taxa on this planet is really the only one. And like you said, Morgan, you can do data, you know, you can do a lot when you have a lot of data, when you even have presence only. but you know, it's a bit more challenging to work with.
Thanks, Brian. I have a question coming in from the audience that I'm going to again attempt to try and tie into another question here. We'll see how it goes. But this is a question on, is anyone working on connecting local Audubon chapters to these apps? And I think the bigger picture idea here that I would like to know about is not necessarily local Audubon chapters, but local conservation efforts and how an app like eBird, I can speak to it directly as the program director for Marcus Audubon because we're working directly with Morgan's lab. But I'm curious to know how eBird might connect with local conservation efforts and where the scientific portion of that fits in, but also where the social aspect of eBird might fit into that as well.
I can try and start. And a lot of this is not really necessarily what I do per se, or what my lab does, but what I know exists out there. And one of the things actually that I know that the Lab of Ornithology is doing, the lab that runs eBird as a platform, is that they are working pretty heavily with sort of fine scale conservation units, whether or not that's like national parks or smaller like state parks. And management units to try and bring the weight of data from eBird down to smaller scales. It was one of the difficulty things, which I think this question acknowledges, is that eBird allows us as scientists to ask really, really big questions, right? Like we can study where birds are across the entire world, across, you know, every day of the year. But how do we then bring that down to a really, really small scale? And this is a problem that, you know, this question of scaling is also like kind of a somewhat boring but exciting academic topic as well, of like, how do we take large scale phenomenon and shrink them down to make them useful for a local park or, you know, or a preserve in some ways. And so part of that can be done through, you know, leveraging data outside of those platforms to say, well, we can build models of where species should be, so that even if we have a place where no one has ever submitted an eBird checklist, based off of its characteristics, its satellite imagery, its environmental history, its climate, we can predict what's likely to be there. And therefore, we might be able to actually do some prioritization or say, well, this seems like a really, really cool area where we need to go do more surveys. But if we actually do have a place, which is true, say, for I think probably most places in California, where we do have checklists and we do have data, we can start to say, well, how well is this place sort of performing, overperforming, or underperforming from a biodiversity perspective? As I said, I've been working with the city of Los Angeles to actually quantify biodiversity in the city. And so LA City basically has like their own version of what's known as the Singapore Index, because Singapore developed it first, but it's long-term biodiversity monitoring across lots and lots of different things that people care about. And one of them is how well sort of non-urban species come into urban areas. And so I've been working with the city of Los Angeles to come up with a way to basically evaluate this on an annual or semi-annual basis. And we're bringing in iNaturalist data as well, so we can do this not just for birds, but for lots of other things that people record and take and care about. But this allows us to say, okay, well, this park in Los Angeles is overperforming in biodiversity. That is to say, it has more cool biodiversity in it than we would expect, whereas this one seems to be underperforming. And like, what does that mean? Does that mean that we should look at like what shrubs and trees are planted? Like, does this mean, is there environmental pollution? This allows city managers to start to look at really, really fine scale of, you know, what's going on in their city, so that we can, as an entire, you know, megalopolis here in LA, try and build a more diverse, healthier ecosystem.
Thanks, Morgan. That's fascinating. Anyone else before we move on?
I would just like to jump in and to the idea of whether we engage with local Audubon chapters or conservation entities, eBird really sees itself as a platform for data collection. It's kind of openly available, flexible. Any group can take it and use it for data entry and pull the data out of eBird. So we have data output tools that allow you to do everything from querying and downloading raw data to exploring modeled data. And there's a big difference depending on your use case in which one is appropriate, right? So if you're someone like Tom and you're looking at, I need all the records, I need to look at the records of rose-breasted grosbeak for San Luis Obispo County for North American birds, he can go do that, download a file of all the reports, see those raw eBird data, and do what he needs to do. But if you're someone who has a ranch, for example, and you want to know about biodiversity on your ranch, you might want to look at modeled data. As Morgan was just talking about, you could draw a polygon on a map and find out what is happening with Bell's sparrow based on the modeled data on your ranch, and there's all kinds of different tools that the eBird status and trends and science team has built to enable access to data in different spatial scales and all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of tools out there already and more to come for ways that people can dig into it.
Thanks, Brian. And just a quick clarification, this is a question that came in earlier as well, is that data for extraction for anybody who wants to have detailed data for analyses, and what is the process for requesting that data?
Yeah, so eBird data products have a mostly, first of all, yes, all the data are openly available. There is an automated form that you fill out that basically gives you an access key that, basically what we're trying to do is filter out commercial uses of the data in that query. So if you're someone who's a researcher, educator, you go in and put your query in and then you get an access key and you can download any and all eBird data products. The only exception to that is sensitive species data. So we work with partners globally to identify sensitive species, both regionally and seasonally. And when a record is flagged as sensitive, you have to actually talk to a human being at the lab to get those data, because we want to make sure that we're not promoting uses of the data for things like the cage bird trade, any number of other things that would be bad. So yeah, it's a pretty advanced system at this point for data access.
The one warning I'll give on that is be careful what you ask for, because eBird files can be large, very, very large. If you're just like, oh, I'm just going to download the eBird data for California for the last 5 years, your computer might just be downloading for like 24 hours, depending on your download speed. So, if you want to do it, just be careful what your query is for.
Tread lightly, he says.
Yeah,
well,
can I say one other thing about working with conservation organizations?
Yeah.
That's it. On a more on the ground level, I have gone out with for Slow Land Conservancy when they have acquired properties prior to them opening to the public and set up point counts that are then recorded in eBird. And so those points are something that the Land Conservancy can then go back and look at after they maybe do some habitat restoration. And they can have a timely look at how things have changed since they've taken over or since they've let public onto the property. And so that's another valuable use, I think, for trying to work with conservation organizations. You can set up things that they can use in the future.
Thanks, Tom. Great. Well, we are coming up to the hour and 15-minute mark. So I'm just going to ask everyone one more question as a bit of a close. And we started off by talking about how eBird fits into your life now and how it's impacted you. And I think I want to finish by looking to the future. And I want to ask you, each of you, personally, how you see eBird continuing being in your life, and then how you see eBird how it might grow in the future, and in any way, shape, or form. So it's a bit open-ended, and see who wants to start.
I don't want to start this one. Can I end this one?
Sure. We'll end with Brian. We've got a taker for ending it.
I can go. I was gonna wait. I was gonna wait it out, but I'll go. Maybe I'll inspire some other thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, from the scientific perspective, I see four areas where eBird is growing, which will change what we can do with science. I maybe the fifth would be breeding codes, which we already talked about. I think just the more information that people can give on individual birds can be useful in weird ways. So one is just photos. So eBird is increasingly becoming an archive for photos, which means that, you know, particularly for common species, suddenly we have photos of thousands and thousands of photos of birds in a specific place at a specific time. And for my scientists who study like evolution of molt or evolution of color pigmentation, like there's a lot of really cool untapped potential there. Particularly as we develop AI tools to automatically filter through those thousands of photos to pick out specific things. The ability to sort of sift data from things that it's hard for us or time intensive for us as humans to do is going to rapidly change. So photos, similarly sound, so uploading sound recordings, particularly integration with Merlin, is sound is already revolutionizing birds. People are recording birds all the time, and scientists are now starting to take all these recordings and do a lot of really cool stuff with it. And that field is particularly fueled by AI is just taking off right now. It's very quickly changing. And then the final thing I'll say is also just eBird outside of the United States. So as and it's not just Americans who go on vacation and submit checklists from Costa Rica, but it's actually getting eBird used by Costa Ricans or used by Chinese, used by South Africans. You know, we have in ecology, which is my field, we have huge spatial biases where we have tons of data from the United States and Europe and just vast empty amount of biodiversity data in the rest of the world. And so the ability to get eBird used by communities outside the United States and outside of Europe will be incredibly valuable.
Thanks, Maureen. I think that touches on something briefly that we didn't quite get to tonight, but that eBird, from my experience, is actually often used as a bit of a commercial tool at times by guides in either the United States or in other countries. Just another interesting aspect of how eBird works.
Who else?
I was hoping Sierra or Ronan would chime in with some younger generation perspective.
I'm not sure how much I have to add, but I've noticed like more people around me getting eBird, like since I've started like being an officer at the bird club, I've noticed more people actually downloading it with encouragement. So I definitely see the eBird member pool growing a lot in the future.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts as well, but mostly the things that Morgan brought up. It's the integration with like sound and pictures and visuals, and maybe the visualizations that you were mentioning at the beginning, Brian, where you have these sort of, mapped out spatial diagrams and having the data in a visual way. That could also be something that, could be brought to the forefront of eBird in the future, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking as I'll leave my stand as a moderator really quick here and just briefly put my 2 cents in as a fellow young birder, is that I think a bit of my view of eBird in the future is growing into a dynamic tool that brings all of this together, right? Brings science together, brings what Morgan was touching on together, with some of the more social aspects of what Merlin might be, right? That's kind of what Brian touched on earlier, is bringing those into a unified tool that can promote conservation, that can promote science, that can promote birding in all sorts of different communities with younger generations across the world. I think it's a really powerful tool moving forward. See if Tom has anything to say, and if not, we can finish the night off with Brian.
Yeah, I'm not big on the future, so I'll let Brian talk about that. I mean, I guess one thing I will mention, though, is just from the immediate past, and that's that as a reviewer, I truly believe there was a pandemic bump in eBird. I think that brought a lot of people into birding when they were trapped home. And, it's just an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Brian, let's see what you have to say to finish us off.
Yeah, I think that, at the lab, at the Cornell lab of ornithology, we're really excited by this idea of using birds as this metric to sort of measure the heartbeat of this planet. It's the only biological surface that we think we can generate daily, around this world, to help us understand how our ecosystems are doing. We know we can do that in some places with eBird today, but there's a lot of gaps, right? So one of the things we'll be focused on in the future is expanding this data collection model by engaging different communities all around the world, making sure that eBird, Merlin, Birds of the World is an ecosystem that works to suit their needs, not just the needs of birders or researchers in North America. We got to think beyond that. And then I think there's a really, really exciting research potential in bioacoustics and how we leverage bioacoustics and automated recording units and different kinds of sensors to fill those spatial data gaps where we know we're never going to get birders to go. So how do we use the brains that exist in Merlin today, and turn those into checklists of birds that we could then pull together with checklists of birds generated by human beings, make sure we don't mess anything up in the process, and create a better, more powerful way to model birds by bringing observational data and acoustic data together. I think that's a big research challenge for the next 5-10 years. As Morgan said, AI tools are going to unlock our ability to extract data from your photos that, all we are going to ask birders to do is go out and observe birds and continue to have fun and engage with nature. When you come back in and you upload those photos, though, we'll be able to run them through computer vision models that can tell us a lot of stuff about the birds, like, are they molting? How old are they? What sex are they? What are they eating? What habitats are they in? There's so much data in those photos that we're barely scratching the surface on right now. It's super exciting. And then I think more broadly from the lab's vision and strategy perspective, you can think of the last 20 years as like data in, and how do we build a system to engage communities to collect enough data that would allow us to build models that people could actually use for actionable science and conservation results, right? And we've done that now. And we've figured out kind of how that works in some channels in North America. And our challenge in the future is how do we scale that now to the world? How do we really get, ramp up data collection so that we've got that global surface? And then most importantly, how do we get those data in useful ways into the hands of the key actors that are actually doing conservation on the ground? Because we know that, collecting the data and analyzing the data are great, but if you're not getting the data into the hands of the people and organizations around the world who are actually doing the conservation work in a meaningful way, you're kind of missing the boat. So I think the lab's real goal in the next 10 to 20 years is how do we identify those key actors on the ground and make sure that everything we are doing helps them do what they need to do. Because that's, I think, the only way we're going to achieve conservation at scale, which is, absolutely our #1 priority now for the next couple decades, because we're running out of time, I'm afraid.
Well, on that note, well, thank you so much to all of the panelists and to all of the participants tonight. It's been a real joy hearing all of your perspectives on eBird and conservation and science. And if we could give a round of applause on Zoom, I would, but everybody is probably clapping on the other side. Thank you all so much. I did want to just say that Marcos Audubon, we're really thrilled to be able to put programs like this on and just check in with what we're doing down on the Central Coast here. We're in San Luis Obispo and San Luis Obispo County mostly, and we're working on all aspects. And I hope that this program, this panel was really helpful to you in gaining some insight on how eBird is working within birding culture and conservation and science. And I really encourage all of you to download Merlin, download eBird, go out in the field, and they're really fantastic apps. And as you can see, you're directly contributing to combating climate change and combating these scary things like that. So with that, we'll conclude. And thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.